When you think of a domestic maid, what pops into your head? Maybe it's the polished, deeply romanticized drama of a show like Downton Abbey. Or, perhaps it's the highly stylized pop culture aesthetic of a modern maid cafe. But the historical reality of domestic service in Victorian and Edwardian Britain, well, it was absolutely anything but a cozy costume drama. It was a massive, physically grueling industry built on strict social hierarchies and profound class subjugation. To really get our heads around this today, I want you to picture a slightly softer, allegorical world. Imagine a grand, luxurious household run by pampered, aristocratic cats who were served hand and foot by an army of exhausted, lesser animals, like hard-working field mice. I'm your host, and today, in this explainer, we're going to strip away the pop culture myths. We're diving into the hard data, the diaries, and the historical records to uncover the true cost of what was once known as the servant problem. Let's get into it.
So what exactly was the servant problem? Well, during this era, middle-class households were rapidly expanding. Everybody wanted to live like the aristocracy. But suddenly, our aristocratic feline families faced a massive shortage of compliant, willing domestic labor. This absolute panic was universally referred to in newspapers and households as the servant problem. But you have to ask, whose problem was it really? And who actually solved it?
It really depends on who you ask. If you looked at the situation from the mistress's point of view, our high society cat upstairs, the servant's problem was a frustrating shortage of reliable, obedient workers. They simply couldn't find good help anymore. But if you look at it from the maid's perspective, our exhausted field mouse downstairs, the problem was the job itself. We're talking shockingly low wages, terrible living conditions, and incredibly authoritarian employers.
To understand why this friction was such a huge deal, we really have to grasp the sheer scale of the industry. Are you ready for this number? 1.3 million. By the 1911 census, there were roughly 1.3 million women working in private domestic service in England and Wales alone. It was literally the most common form of female employment at the time. To put that into perspective, that is a massive chunk of the working class population living inside the homes of the middle and upper classes, making this one of the most widespread labor environments in the entire country.
Section 1. Life below the stairs. The rigid hierarchy of the household.
Let's explore life below the stairs because the strict hierarchy of the household wasn't just masters versus servants. The servant quarters had an almost military ranking system of their own. You had the upper servants, the house steward, the housekeeper, the butler, and the cook. They enjoyed significantly better food, often sharing the exact same diet as their employers, and lived in their own modest, comfortable apartments. Think of them like the favored lapdogs of the household. Then you had the lower servants, the footmen, housemaids, scullery maids, and laundry maids. They were the ones doing the brutal, bone-aching physical labor, typically eating plain food and sleeping in dark, cramped attics or damp basements.
And the stark economic reality for these lower-tier workers? It was bleak. An entry-level lower servant earned roughly between 12 and 18 pounds for an entire year of labor. Even for the time, this was essentially a subsistence-level wage. Employers justified it by saying the position included room and board, even if that room was literally a shared cot in a freezing attic.
Moving on to the scullery maid, the lowest rung of the ladder.
At the absolute lowest rung of this ladder was the scullery maid. This was often the youngest, lowest-ranking, and most physically taxed female servant in the entire household, usually starting her career in her early teens. A typical Victorian housemaid's diary reveals a completely brutal daily reality. Look at this timeline. At 6 a.m., she's awake, cleaning grates and hauling hot water. By 8:30 a.m., she's hauling heavy coal buckets and sweeping. At 1 p.m., more heavy hauling of hot water up multiple flights of stairs just so the family can wash before lunch. 5 p.m. means relighting fires, and at 11:30 p.m., she finally retires for the night. That is a grueling 15 to 16-hour workday filled with relentless physical exertion and practically zero free time.
And doing this day in and day out, well, it came with severe occupational hazards. Maids frequently developed housemaid's knee, which is a really painful form of osteoarthritis from constantly kneeling on hard stone floors to scrub them. Their hands were often cracked and bleeding from prolonged exposure to harsh cleaning agents like soap, vinegar, and baking soda, leaving them highly vulnerable to sepsis from infections. And on top of the physical toll, they endured constant verbal abuse, strict surveillance, and even threats of sexual harassment from male members of the household, with almost zero legal recourse. Absolutely wild.
Next up, feminism's class conflict, the price of liberation.
This extreme subjugation brings us to a fascinating class conflict that developed in the early 20th century, right as the middle-class women's suffragist movement was gaining massive momentum. In 1911, an anonymous domestic worker signed a letter to a suffragist newspaper called The Common Cause, asking a really pointed question. Why don't suffragists begin their reform work at home? She pointedly asked why middle-class women were fighting so hard for political equality with men, but completely ignoring the women laboring 15 hours a day inside their very own homes. If they wanted equality, she argued, why not put servants on a 12-hour shift like standard workmen? Talk about hitting the nail on the head. This brilliantly illustrates a deep, complex historical paradox. Middle-class suffragists desperately needed servants. They relied on them to take over all household duties, so they had the free time to march, protest, and dedicate themselves to political activism. But inadvertently, this meant their political liberation was being directly subsidized by the subjugation of working-class women. It was a profound class conflict between women of the very same era, and it shows just how complicated this history really is.
Which brings us to militant maids and unions, fighting for dignity.
Working-class domestic workers didn't just accept this reality. Inspired by both the broader labor movements and the political energy of the suffragists, they started fighting back. Enter the trailblazers, Kathleen Oliver and Jessie Stephen. Picture them as fierce, organizing animals determined to stand up to the feline aristocracy. Kathleen Oliver, who was a domestic cook herself, founded the Domestic Workers' Union of Great Britain in the spring of 1910. They were determined to fight for basic human rights and dignity for the hundreds of thousands of women trapped in service. Listen to these powerful words from Kathleen Oliver in 1909. The average employer of domestic labor regards this work as one of the lowest and meanest order, and domestic workers as menials and as infinitely their inferiors. I respect myself. Wow. It is a blistering, brilliant quote. It completely shatters the myth of the perfectly happy, grateful servant and highlights a fierce demand for dignity. They weren't just asking for money. They were demanding to be seen as human beings. And they backed that up with concrete, perfectly reasonable demands. The union fought for a 12-hour maximum shift to align with industrial workers. They demanded better food, proper living accommodations, an end to arbitrary employer tyranny. And they wanted all of these protections enforced by actual government legislation, not just the whims of a so-called generous master.
Section 4. The End of an Era and the Decline of the Servant Economy.
So what actually brought about the end of this era? Why don't we see households running with dozens of maids today? Well, the massive domestic service industry eventually collapsed, but it wasn't just one single event that ended it. There were three main catalysts that dismantled the Edwardian servant model. First, the World Wars. When men went off to fight, massive numbers of women left domestic service to take up factory jobs, discovering much better pay and way more freedom. Second, industrialization brought about the rise of automated home appliances. Think washing machines, vacuums, gas stoves. These massively reduced the sheer physical labor needed to run a home. And third, the expansion of public education meant women finally had access to diverse career paths outside of someone else's kitchen.
While the old world of aristocratic cats and servant mice is mostly gone, the servant aesthetic survives today, though it is definitely mutated. It's either fetishized in pop culture through things like Japanese maid cafes, where you pay for the illusion of aristocracy, or it's been elevated into the modern luxury hospitality industry. Interestingly enough, the role of the butler still exists today, catering to the global ultra-rich and often earning massive six-figure salaries. Quite the shift from £12 a year, right?
This leaves us with a provocative thought to wrap up on. We look back at the Victorian class system and we love to congratulate ourselves for dismantling it. But did we really? Or have we simply outsourced the servant problem? When we pay for gig economy cleaners, luxury hotel staff, and on-demand delivery, have those deep class frictions truly disappeared, or have they just changed their uniforms? Think about that the next time you sit down to watch a period drama. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.
Knowledge grows through sharing. What are your thoughts on today's topic? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe as we continue to grow together.